So I'm going to be presenting Kids, Cats, and Control, Designing Privacy and Security Dashboards for IoT Home Devices. And you can see that this work was done with a number of authors from our institution and also with colleagues from Western Washington University and Purdue University. So one of the things that we were looking at with this was actually seeing what we could do with a number of IoT devices. Instead of just looking at one particular IoT device, we were interested in seeing what happens with a number of IoT devices in a home setting for an entire network. How do people interact with more than one, having all these set up in their homes? So we use a survey to recruit participants through Nextdoor and mailing lists and the university classifieds for a screening survey to find out, are they interested in IoT? How much experience do they have? And more importantly, do they have access to their home internet routers? Because if they aren't able to access their own network, we wouldn't be able to actually have them install these IoT devices. So from those 48 people that we connected, we filtered responses down to 21 that were incomplete or had inability to access the routers. And from those, we sent out requests from the additional 19. 8 got back to us and said, yeah, I would be interested in, having these different devices, working with you, conducting this study, participating, and having these in my home, testing them out, using them, and talking with you on a weekly basis to kind of find out what their reactions were and going through that. So we got 8 respondents responded and for our in-home recruitment. So for these, we actually sent them a box filled with these IoT devices. So you might be able to see in this picture here that in the top, we have an Android tablet that we sent them, a router, couple different Raspberry Pis, which I can tell you one was marked as the Home Assistant. So it actually worked to pull information from all these different IoT devices and display it as a dashboard on the Android tablet for everyone. The other one was a safe router that actually monitored all the network for these IoT devices in the subnetwork that they set up to pull in information to see what the routes were for these devices. Say, hey, is your Amazon Ring alarm system connecting to a server that, isn't Amazon? If it is, we'll throw an alarm to say, hey, this is talking to someone they shouldn't be. Thankfully, I'll let you know now, that didn't actually happen. We also send them a Philips Hue light bulb set. And if you can see in sort of the middle right on the far side, on that small board that has a small dome over it, that's actually what we use in place of a thermostat to just give them temperature data for inside their home, because it had a thermometer or a temperature sensor, a humidity sensor, and a motion sensor. And so that gave them that sort of information about the temperature inside of their homes, because we thought about sending them like a Nest thermostat or one of those other smart IoT thermostats. But one of the things that we thought about when we were looking at these and trying to think about setting this up was the fact that all of those require an electrician to put in. And one of the things from our participants that we were looking at and discussing with them beforehand was that a lot of them live in single homes or in apartments. And if you are renting especially, changing out that level of hardware in your home would probably require, landlord permission, or you might be violating your lease. And that would be an additional cost as well. And we didn't want to put that burden on participants. So instead, we gave them these devices to act as their thermostats, to just give them readings in their homes. And if they wanted to adjust their own thermostats, they could. So in this diagram, you can see the basic network that they set up from these, pulling everything out of the box and setting up themselves. Originally, the plan was for us to go into the homes and watch them set up everything out of the box and do a think aloud process. But because this was done during COVID-19 and summer, we wrote all the directions down and sent the box to them with 4 pages of instructions of just with photos of saying, please plug this in here, connect this here. And we ran a pilot study with one of the researchers actually going through and walking through with one of their parents through the entire process, and then reiterated on our instructions before we actually sent this out. So they actually created this subnetwork connecting all their devices. And when we actually went through this, everyone was able to connect and have all their devices working within the first week by the time we had our first interview being done. So here's an example of what the dashboard looks like for them. This is a mock-up because what actually looked like for their tablet, I can't actually directly show because it shows too much information about the participant. So this is the mock-up for you. So you can see it has information about the lights, what they labeled them, the temperature that they were getting from the different readings. It pulled in weather data from the location that we were in. It could be set up for the doorbell or the different sensors for the Ring alarm system. And the network gate was actually something from the safe router, which could be triggered on or off to allow additional people to connect to your Wi-Fi. So if you wanted to lock your Wi-Fi where devices that aren't already connected to it can't then connect to it, you could lock your gate. So your Wi-Fi would be locked so new connections couldn't be made. The user status could identify, for example, if one person is home, one person's away, and someone else is like actively using the dashboard. That's what the indicators are for there. When we look at the different participants that we had 8 of them. They range from age of 22 up to 59. We had 4 women and 4 men. And we looked at the different households. We found that 4 of them were single households, single people living alone. 3 of our households had 2 adults living in them, and 1 household had 2 adults with 2 children under the age of 18, which you can see signified by the 2 with the asterisks. All of our interviews over 8 weeks lasted approximately 30 minutes each. And week 1 focused on the process of setting up IoT devices and the system and making sure that they were comfortable having all the devices, everything was working. Did they encounter any issues? And helping them troubleshoot if they had run into anything. Weeks 2 through 4 focused on design prompts and the interactions and the questions that we had for them. And then week 5 had the exit interview with general reflections on IoT, and also us going through, again, iterating that all the devices that we had sent them, they would continue to keep, but that afterwards, if they had any issues, it would kind of be on them to maintain their own networks. So one of the things that we found very interesting when we were talking with them in the pre-survey was asking them about what devices they specifically had used themselves or owned. So most of them had a smart TV. It was the most common one that people actively owned or had previously owned, like 7 of 8. The second most common device was a voice assistant, such as an Amazon Echo or a Google Home, with 5 of our 8 participants having them. And past that, it drops down quite a bit, with smart cameras, smart thermostat, and smart power outlets being the next most common devices. But that's not the only thing that they spoke of having. When we asked them like what they thought of an IoT device and what came to mind when we talked with them about them, like what they first pictured, every participant actually mentioned digital voice assistants. So they mentioned using their like Siri or the Google Home or the Google Assistant. Sorry, I don't remember what it's actually called on Android right now. But they mentioned those specifically and said, oh yeah, I use this all the time. And they consider that part of IoT, despite it being on their phone. And that's not always what we consider IoT. Another thing that people brought up was that wearable devices. So 6 of our participants mentioned specifically Fitbits or Apple Watches as being devices that they considered as being Internet of Things, because they're like, oh yeah, I wear this all the time. It goes with me. This is, a smart device. It's, an Internet of Things because it's a thing and it's smart and I take it with me. And that was their mental model for having these. So when we look at our participants again, we can see that, quite a few of them, well, all except for one, lived in an apartment building. One participant lived in a single family home. So what sort of impact does this have on people's adoptions for IoT devices when you have all of these restraints on what you can and can't install? I know in previous apartments, I couldn't hang a picture frame without the worry of having to, whether or not I could get back a security deposit. Because one concern that they were mentioning was can I actually install this security system, or will this be a problem with, my lease? So who can use the IoT device is also a thing that that got brought up in our discussions. So when we asked most all of our participants, half of them, just the person that we interviewed was the only person who ever used the dashboard or any of the IoT devices. 4 of the participants did state that they actually discussed the IoT devices and showed the dashboard to someone else in their home. Usually it was a roommate or a partner or spouse. But they also said that the partner or spouse never interacted with the IoT devices, except in one case. So 1 out of our 8 participants had someone else besides themselves use it. Most of them just said that they saw it or looked at it, but they never actually had any interactions. And then when we looked at the dashboard and saw that we asked them about what they were doing with it and allowing remote access, they said, hey, being able to see whether or not anyone else is connected to my network, that would be useful, but it wasn't useful at the time. Because during the time of the interviews, no one was having anyone over to their homes. So it was not actually a useful case because they never had guests. So the only time they ever saw anyone on their network was themselves or the people they live with. So the activity metrics never were useful for them. So they never had to worry about guests connecting to their network because at that time, no one was actually helping or connecting. So this use case might have been useful in a different context, but they didn't find a use for it. It wasn't one that they actually found very useful. They did have everyone successfully identify that the green icon surrounding a user meant that they were online and active, and that gray was away and not actually there. Only about 50% of the participants actively identified that the user that was the blue icon was supposed to represent their activity, that they were the one online and actively in control. One thing that got brought up along with the discussion of IoT devices was the sustainability of the devices and strategies for dealing with them. So the majority of our participants all mentioned that they had a device somewhere that they had interacted with that was sitting in a closet somewhere collecting dust, or that had broken and they had to replace it. But a number of them also mentioned that they didn't actually have a strategy or know what to do with the device after it broke. And they mentioned not having an idea of where to take it to recycle. They didn't know exactly what to do with it because they're like, I shouldn't really just throw this in the trash. They had that concept and idea, but they didn't know of somewhere they could take it or if it should be taken to a store and just like return there and let someone else recycle it, or if someone had a program, or if they needed to call a company, or there was no real strong idea that they had of like what to do for the end of a program. One participant specifically mentioned having a wearable device that the company no longer existed. And she's like, I can't call the company and ask them what to do about it because they no longer exist. So their code isn't supported. So the watch no longer functions. So I just have a fancy piece of plastic jewelry that doesn't do anything. Like the parts may still be good in it, but I don't know what to do with it. And so he said he just kept it in a drawer and it's just sitting there and doesn't know what to do. So that's one area that we found that was common across most of our participants, was having this lack of idea of a strategy for what to do at the end of the life cycle for a product. So the majority of the participants said they would also ask friends or family when they would troubleshoot a device. 7 of our 8 participants. Only 1 participant mentioned contacting a formal third party, such as like the IT department for their work or university. And there was a slight difference for preference for written steps over videos when troubleshooting. So 5 of our 8 participants. And not a single participant actually mentioned contacting the device manufacturer as a potential strategy. So no one viewed that or thought of that as a way to deal with a malfunctioning device. No one actually thought of like contacting customer service. When we looked at dashboard interactions, one of the things that we found was that participants checked the status of the dashboard quite frequently, but very infrequently change settings. So they would check things daily or multiple times a day, but wouldn't actually go further in and interact further. So just checking in, but not actually changing or doing anything else. The landscape view was what they said they preferred the most. And we went through, they specifically said that the single location for the status of multiple devices overall was viewed very positively, but the largest criticism was limited control over the apps, as it didn't have as much customization and control as if they went to a specific app designed for one specific device, such as if they wanted to control the lights. Of course, the Philips Hue app had more control and could be customized more than if they just were using the dashboard itself. And then the notifications that we discussed with them, were also very preference based on context. So when we asked how they wanted to receive notifications and how they receive them currently from different systems about weather alerts, emergency alerts, these different types of things, how would they want to know if something was happening with their system, or such as like the security alarm system? How would they want to be notified if perhaps they weren't at home, or if they were at home and they were viewing the system and something was happening on their network? How would they want to be notified? So they specifically said they wanted to have a variety of methods based on where they were at and severity. So a number of folks said, hey, I would want a text message or maybe a phone call if it's extremely an emergency. If it's something mundane and not an emergency, an email, so I can, file it away and look at them all later and keep track of them and report them later. And so it varied by that. So this is an area where more research may need to be done. So some of the takeaways that we have is that IoT is broadly inclusive of device type, and that our users don't have as strict of a definition as what we might think of for what specifically is an IoT. And allow for altering the properties of device for specific usage scenarios, and then selective inclusion of device in networks. So adding a new smart TV, but maybe not a guest Bluetooth speaker, is something that they kind of want to have that option to do. So having that sort of choice of being able to identify something and perhaps add it to their own secure dashboard and see the information of without adding it to their own controls. Having more information that we can give them about end of life cycles and being able to send that information and give people the feedback that they need for what to do and design that. And then giving dashboards where we know that even though they are seeing it and not maybe changing it, and how that might check or change in different contexts. So for example, at home, someone viewing it may only view it occasionally. But if we switch that to, say, a factory setting where a dashboard, someone is actively watching it as part of their job and in a large setting for a factory that is going 24/7, that's very different contexts. And they may be viewing a dashboard and interacting with it much more regularly. So this is an area where additional research might also benefit from seeing what happens when you have all these additional sensors and IoT devices connected to one another. And then asking for notification preferences with multiple choices available, as the content and context of messages can change what their preferred method and notifications are. So thank you.
The presentation was really great. I have one question. I saw in the participants there are also people, I guess, who had no experience with smart devices, IoT devices, and then I guess P4 who had experience with everything.
Yes.
So did you find any significant difference between the experiences, particularly for those participants who wanted more versus less?
So for those two specifically, yes. P4, I don't have it here, but before the image that I showed you of the graph showing the network connections, they basically drew it out by hand and sent it to me, and we're extremely close, like graphing it out, and that is the level that they have for like their technology knowledge, and they had that, and it was very impressive. I kind of regret not actually putting it in the paper, but whereas P2, like you said, had no actual interactions. Like the IoT devices we sent them were the very first ones they actually ever used. So, but like you can still see a lot of their responses were still very similar in what they were having of like, again, 7 of 8 and other ones of people having the same reactions. So that's one of the ones that I really like. So, thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering, this might be a bit out of the scope, but when you discussed sort of on a privacy level, potential benefits of having a home assistant running in your own local network versus the sort of manufacturer-based applications, because you mentioned that people missed the additional features. But I was wondering whether part of the interviews was also about having it locally versus everything going directly back to the manufacturer. That was anything that you covered.
So that was one of the things that we didn't directly cover talking with them, but it is one of the things that people had mentioned. So DataSmith had access to run everything on the apps themselves, and so a number of people actually did that, going through and setting up, for example, and like more complicated routines with the lights, for example. But that was also where they said, oh, I would like the dashboard better if I didn't have to go through into another app to be able to do this. So it was just one of the things of saying, like, okay, they want the additional capabilities in being able to be accessed from one location rather than having to go outside into another app, which was not what we had planned or built. So okay, well, that would be nice, but it's not what we have.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm Danny Huang from New York University. I have 2 questions. about real-world deployment. First question is that do you have any plans for potentially real-world deployment on, say, more participants? And second question is, if you were to deploy it, what would you think would be some of the challenges?
So we don't have any current plans on deploying this further currently. This is one that it will definitely take me writing a grant and getting more funding to do any of this again, because this was very complicated to try to do, and like just doing the 8 people was a ton of work. But one of the complications of, like you said, setting this out was being able to actually conduct all of these interviews, all the studies, and there was a lot of data that we even weren't able to collect because of the different pandemic restrictions at the time. So we weren't able to actually do the walkthroughs of watching everyone's stuff and have additional information about what their actual practices were using the IoT devices. And if I could go back and do it again, I would ask, set up more tasks for people to do to make sure they're actually using the devices more, right? Which I didn't actually have. So if I could do that over again, I would probably do that too.
Hi, I'm Jayati from Dartmouth College. I have one question about that. I think you say that dashboard is not equal to the control panel, so just controlling devices and these kind of things. So I wonder, like, are there any imagined use cases during your interview to say, like, what kind of control the user wants from this dashboard?
Okay, so the dashboard can control the devices to some small extent. So they can, on the dashboard, they can turn on and off the lights, for example, or arm and disarm the security alarm. But for more fine-grained controls, they have to go directly into the device themselves. So that's the one where they can't do all of the things. So that was one of the issues that we had. So they did mention not having full control like the app itself did, but they did enjoy being able to do basic controls like just turning on and turning off the lights or arm and disarm without having to go outside of it. One of the ones that they actually didn't like as much is not having the option, for example, for like dimming lights. They actually had to go into the other app. So that was one where they said, this would be more convenient if we can have it there.
Hi, I'm Naman from Wisconsin. Great talk. Just to follow up on the question she mentioned, who gets to actually get control of the dashboard? Because in like if I'm family admin setting, it would be like I can see some concerns in the abusive partners or trying to understand and trying to control their partners life or maybe like a parent that would take control over like the children.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we talked about in this was the fact that we only had 4 households that actually had multiple people in it. Everyone that we spoke with, it was the participant themselves that was controlling it. So in one case, it was go back to the participant. So in participant 6, he was controlling the IoT and
like introduced it to his wife, and then she kind of like didn't use it. Participant 8, she introduced it to her roommate, and her roommate chose to not engage with it. Participant 1, she introduced it to her fiance, and he actually helped her set everything up. But after that, he didn't engage with it. So she mostly used it after the initial setup process, after week 1. And then P4, he was the only one who used it. So I don't know how much that dynamic was based off of gender or not, because all the relationships weren't the same. But it was one of the ones that we were also wondering about. I don't know about the children because I don't the children's ages in here, but I know from the interviews, because I did all of them, they were very young, and I don't think they were even old enough to hold a tablet, so they didn't let them use it.